yourself.
I know. My name's Ainsley. Hi, I am a master's student here at UCC. I'm writing, I mostly study artificial intelligence ethics, but I have a small spot in my heart that's dedicated entirely to deconstructing and being annoying about existing things. My brother's in med school, so my current thing is I think medicine is evil. So I'm going to be talking about mostly a paper that I wrote last semester. It's about the deification of medicine and the medicalization of women's issues and how this is used as a form of social control over women. A lot of it is based on a paper called The Last Well Person. It was written by a fellow named... Never mind. It was written by a fellow named Clifton Mader in the early 90s. It's a paper about the risks of medicalization, which is turning basically every human condition into a medical condition instead of just a thing that we exist with. Talking about this culture of medicalization that exists and how we've started turning everything into a medical condition. In this paper, he tells the fictional story of a man, this middle-aged college professor, who goes to the doctor, and his physician finds that he is the last person with whom there is nothing diagnosably wrong with. And so they run every test, every possible thing they can do, and they find that at the end of the day, he is the last well person. It's a really interesting paper. First of all, just the history of medicalization and how things have become medical conditions and the way that we as a society interact with this idea of sickness or deviance from any norms. But most importantly, the thing that I found most interesting is that in his paper, the last well person was a man. And this idea that even in an entirely fictional world where everyone is sick and everyone is unwell, even if there's one person left who is well, that person is going to be a man, because the idea of femininity, this idea of womanhood, I will use the term womanhood loosely, does automatically align with sickness and being unwell. Medicalization, like I said, is the process of defining non-medical problems medically, so things like if you say grief being turned into depression, grief may not be a medical process, but under the lens of depression, it becomes a diagnosis. And it is taking the different notions we have of health across different groups of people and deciding what is healthy and what is not healthy in these different groups, specifically men's versus women's health. I actually don't know if you have it here. There's this really annoying magazine in America called Women's Health, and it's entirely written about how to get skinny, new diets, new fads, all of this really atrocious stuff. And there's another magazine called Men's Health, which is their sort of off-branch, and it's just a bunch of workout plans and advertisements for protein powder. It sort of navigates this branch really well in how we define women's health versus men's health. Something else that really inspired me to start doing this research is I went to a conference about women's health that was hosted at UCC earlier this semester. And every single panel was ultimately about reproductive health. There was stuff about endometriosis, there was stuff about breast cancer, but ultimately all of it comes back to it is tied into reproductive health because this definition of women's health is innately tied to reproductive abilities, whereas men's health is more this masculinized idea of what manliness should be, what being a man is meant to take for a person, or take from a person, what that person is meant to put into the world. We also have this huge problem of deification of medicine, this idea of medicine being an almost godly force. Both the industry itself being treated as a godly force, the pharmaceutical industry has this power over all, their advertisements, the way they put this idea of medicine into the world, and how this comes back in the way we are supposed to interact with our own health based on ads from pharmaceutical companies, and also from the drugs itself. We treat individual pills like they're an almost godly force, this ability to fix almost any problem that exists. Basically, if there's a problem, then the pharmaceutical industry is going to find a way to make a pill that they can sell to you to fix it. So this culture of medicalization is also hugely based on the pharmaceutical industry's attempts to form or make a profit off of things that they can make a problem from. Most importantly, it becomes a tool of social control over women. Things like I mentioned, the reproductive health problem, this fact that whenever we think about women's health, we think about reproductive health. This is enforcing this notion that the most important thing a woman can do, the most important thing a woman can be, is to be a mother and to use their own body to bring more people into the world. More broadly, it also governs the way that women are able to interact with the world around them, with dieting, with pills, with everything about how you move into the world, comes back and is once again based back in how we interact with our own bodies and how the pharmaceutical industry and this culture of medicalization wants us to interact with our own bodies. Women's issues in general, I'm using the term women's issues really loosely. It's basically any issue that can be tied more closely back to femininity or the control over the specifically sexed female body and how these things are interacted with in a medical sphere. More specifically, how these things come to be defined as illness over time. Premenstrual, I cannot say the word menstrual. It's like my one fatal flaw, and I say it a million times in this presentation. PMS becoming a medical condition instead of just something that happens to a person, and just the way that women in general interact with their own bodies and their own femininity, being treated as a illness, as a disease. You can't be annoyed at a person. You're PMSing. You can't be sad about the state of the world. You have depression. You can't be annoyed that everything about your life is expected to, you're going to become a mother someday, you're going to provide, you're going to do this, that, and the other. No, you just have anxiety. This whole thing, taking this more institutional problem that is placed on and over women and treating it as an individual problem. It also takes this idea of societal disagreeing with a person and changes it into sickness. This was a really big thing in the Soviet Union and still is in a lot of parts in the world where either it's a government or just a broader social force doesn't agree with something. May it be political dissent, homosexuality, where instead of just disagreeing with these things morally, they define it as a type of sickness. So specifically in the Soviet Union, political dissenters would be diagnosed with, I cannot for the life of me remember the exact term right now, they would be diagnosed with basically doesn't agree with the government disease and would be put into political prisons because of it. The same thing happens in a lot of parts of the world. Until very recently, and still a lot of parts of the world with queerness, where it is a political or like a sickness in a lot of parts of the world, and a person can really have their life put in actual physical danger because of it. In other parts of the world, it becomes more of a passive governing force, specifically over women. In a lot of European countries, in the Americas, being a woman and the way that women interact with the world around them is very much seen as sickness, if it is a deviance from what the norm of womanhood is as prescribed by men. So there's also been a huge decrease in distress tolerance around the world over the past, I'd say probably 50 years. Part of this is a good thing because it's sort of showing that it's less of a tolerance of some of the nonsense that happens. That's the most, I guess, polite way I can put it. And part of it is because there has been just overall a decrease in distress tolerance from broader social forces. And due to that, it sort of transitions into individuals have a lower distress tolerance and want to live a happier life, which is in some ways a good thing. In some ways, it allows for the pharmaceutical industry to move this prescribing power and continue that form of social control, specifically in any way that it can benefit their own profit margins. And the most important way that they do that is by making every single societal problem an individual problem, specifically things like patriarchy, misogyny, misogynoir specifically, and other ways that these governing forces, these institutional problems, can be made a you issue. So we'll start by move into talking a little bit about disinterest in daily activities and just this idea of anxiety, depression, and how women's interaction with the world around them becomes depression instead of not liking these institutional forces that are working against them. A lot of you, I assume, have read the story The Yellow Wallpaper, or at least are aware of it. It's this wonderful story. It's so distressing. It's written by, what's her name? Jillian something. Can't remember her name right now. I'm horrible with names. It is based off her own life story, where the woman in the story and Jillian, bless her heart, I won't remember her name, is diagnosed with basically bad mom disease and is sent away to the sea, where her husband locks her in the upstairs attic sort of room, and she completely loses her mind up there. She's not allowed to do anything. She's not allowed to talk, read, write. The woman in the story is a writer. She just has to sit there and be alone in her own brain for 3 months. Eventually, she goes crazy and tears the wallpaper off the walls because she's convinced there's a woman trapped in the walls. It's actually just a projection of her own psyche who she is trying to get out. This becomes sort of this sort of projected femininity that she is looking into the walls and seeing a version of herself that she's trying to get out is really similar to what a lot of people perceive themselves as today. This sort of projected idea, this version of themselves that is trapped due to social forces, and this stigma that exists around the idea of disease, around the idea of sickness, specifically being a sick woman, being related immediately to being a bad mom. It absolutely becomes a form of social control over any form of deviance. And when the norm is defined by a group which is diametrically opposed to women by this patriarchal ideal, then any deviance from that, any self-actualization by women is automatically going to be a form of deviance from this patriarchal norm. So in this sense, the very idea of medicine becomes a masculine force meant to uphold this type of misogynistic ideology. There's also this risk of social reification of these problems. So taking this idea of women are meant to be mothers, making it a disease to be a bad mother, reifies the idea or makes it real that women are meant to be mothers. Because if being a bad mom is a sickness, then doctors couldn't be wrong, medicine couldn't be wrong. It truly must be the job of a woman to be a good mother if being a good mom is the healthy thing to do. There was a study in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, that found that, obviously incorrectly, found that autism, it's some other fun words for it then, was caused by a woman being a bad mom and failing to connect with her child, or specifically her son, on the level that sons needed to be connected with emotionally by their mother. And so when sons grew up, were demonstrating autistic traits, it became a sort of pushback on the mother saying, well, if you had simply been a good mom in the first place, then there wouldn't be anything quote unquote wrong with your son now. This reifies this idea that it is the job of the mother to sacrifice herself, not only be with her child, be with her son specifically, but to sacrifice everything about herself for the sake of her child. And then, again, it makes these sort of structural problems individual issues. So the structural issue of the definition of femininity and the purpose, quote unquote, of women to be mothers is a individual problem. If you don't like that, you should simply get over it. You should start taking like Valium or something and move on. And again, this shifts the responsibility for the felt effects of any of these issues. It also is a form of psychiatric control by delegitimizing the physical symptoms that women feel based off of both physical and emotional distress caused by this form of social control. PMS is just a really great example for that. It's literally just a hormonal cycle. Everyone in the world experiences hormonal cycles. It's the way being a person exists. But because of the way this hormonal cycle interacts with women and the way they then interact with the rest of the world because of it, it can be used as a tool to quote unquote control women by saying, we don't like the way you're experiencing your symptoms, and therefore we think you are doing it in a way that is sick and thus a deviance. We don't like that you're being mean to me right now. Maybe you should keep it to yourself. Oh, is it your time of the month? That kind of thing. It's also a use of benchmarks for womanhood and this idea of how we progress through lives and eventually hit these different benchmarks of puberty, young adulthood, pregnancy, motherhood, eventually this form of like sort of matriarchal, having sacrificed everything, now it's time to take care of your grandkids too, and forces this problem to become an all in her head situation where even if you've reached the end of your life, sacrificing literally everything that happened before this stage for the sake of, you know, being a good woman or a good mother if you experience any type of distress at any stage of that whole process, it's simply because you're sick. You did everything you were supposed to do. Like, you were a good mom, you were a good wife, you did this, that, and the other. So it must be a you problem and not the fact that you've sacrificed literally your entire life for the people around you instead of for, doing things you want to do. And again, it is really discrediting and negating of an individual person's experiences of reality. If you are depressed, anxious, feeling constantly unfulfilled, feeling lost, and you go to a doctor and you explain all of these symptoms, and you explain how the very world that you're forced to live in has reached a point that you physically cannot function in it, and the doctor says, oh, well, you just need to be taking 10 milligrams of Vyvanse every day and 35 milligrams of sertraline and this, that, and the other. It completely negates the way that you experience reality. It isn't the fact that the world is wrong, it's that there was something wrong with you, and you could have just fixed it the whole time if you thought a little harder, tried a little harder, this kind of thing. And it, again, completely enforces this perception of how reality is meant to be experienced by women and by people in general who are discontent with the overarching patriarchal norms. On this topic of specifically depression and suicidal ideation, there is a paper written in the 70s that describes that we exist in an age of anxiety. And now, because at the time anxiety was like the presiding diagnosis, it was right after anxiety was basically invented by pharmaceutical companies in order to start selling anti-anxiety medications. That's a whole thing. You should look into it. It's really interesting about the invention of anxiety. It happened after they invented PTSD. We had shell shock, and then they invented anxiety. It was really interesting. You should look into it. It's not super on topic here, but we basically now live in an age of depression, where depression is one of the most common diagnoses that a person can have, and twice as many women are diagnosed around the world. Twice as many women are diagnosed with depression as men, and we currently have, as of 2023, I haven't checked this year's statistics yet, they're not out yet for this quarter, we have reached the highest rate of antidepressant prescriptions in history. More people take antidepressants now than at any other period of history, and this idea of depression and medicalizing sadness and grief has become this really presiding social force. I don't know if you've looked outside or experienced the world in the past 4 to 5 years. Things have been not great, just overall. So being able to make it an individual problem that so many geopolitical and domestic systems around the world have been rapidly failing, making it an individual problem, has been a really useful tool of social control, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing effects that are all felt by that from today until today. And modern psychiatry has really taken advantage of conflating this idea of grief or sadness with depression. The difference being grief and sadness exists with cause, and depression exists generally without cause. Grief and, God, this is my rant about the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is useful if you want to have like a list of things that every person experiences, probably average on a week. Everyone's gonna feel sad, everyone's gonna feel a little bit nervous, everyone's gonna feel like they're going crazy at some point. That's just simply how being a person works. And the DSM-5 writes it all so loosely that it is entirely left up to the individual whims of a psychiatrist for how they want to diagnose and treat their patients. And psychologists, that's a whole other thing. That's not even a medical degree. They still get to go through and use the whole DSM-5 to diagnose. That's crazy. That's just like if I'm gonna have a master's soon. If I just went through the DSM-5 and started diagnosing people, that's insane. And then telling them how to exist in the world because of that. But anyways, modern psychiatry has conflated this idea of grief or sadness with depression, thus making any type of sadness with cause a diagnosis as well. In the original version of the DSM-1 even, grief was its own set-aside thing, saying if a person's depression had a direct cause, then it wasn't actually depression. It was grief, it was sadness, You know, if, for example, like your mom dies, you're going to be really upset about that. It's going to have some effects on your life. Originally, that would have just been, you know, grief, and that would have been something that person works through. After a long time, if you're still experiencing those symptoms that sort of affect in the same way, it would have become depression. But now, if my mom passed away and then I went to a psychiatrist, I would immediately be diagnosed with depression because the idea of cause is no longer prevalent in modern psychiatry. That's my rant on the DSM-5 and why it sucks and modern psychiatry. But there's this total ignorance towards context in modern medicine, specifically modern psychiatry, and by ignoring context, it further reinforces this idea that things are an individual problem instead of a systemic issue. Culturally, sadness also changes a lot from place to place, both the idea of what sadness is and the actual physical manifestations of sadness that a person feels. This is another really interesting thing people should look into. Like, the way people in, like, Nigeria experience sadness is entirely different from the way people in Argentina experience sadness. Like, they just have completely different physical manifestations of it. It's really cool. And it's entirely based on the cultural context that a person exists in. So this is like yet another layer of context that quote-unquote mental illness exists within that is completely ignored by modern psychiatry when we've tried to sort of internationalize all of these things. It also really changes how we define both pathological and disorder and what is normal and what is deviance from the norm. And ultimately all comes back to fueling this over-treatment of depression and the deification of these treatments, a magic little pill that can fix all of your problems. Self-care this is another one of my little rants. I have really big feelings about this. When I was researching this paper, I was being so loose with my search terms, so I just Googled self-care. And if you Google self-care and look at Google Images, it's a bunch of like pink graphics with flowers on them. And one of them, like the second one, when I was looking at it, was the second tip was to check where you are in your cycle. And it made me so mad. I had to like step out of the library and call my mom. I was so upset about it. This idea that both A, self-care is treatment for disorder, mental disorder, by the layperson on themselves, and this sort of cultural expectation that it is a completely feminized activity, both because A, that like really harms men in general, to make this idea of like, you know, taking care of yourself is like the girly thing to do, but also that when you look at like the narrative of self-care, it's very feminized activity. It's just like, you know, take a bath, do a face mask, paint your nails, this whole thing. It's really annoying. And it, again, super pushes this narrative that things are an individual problem instead of a systemic issue that is existing in the world. Because if I'm depressed about the way that the world exists and the way that, you know, the existence of patriarchy is like getting me down, and I paint my nails and that didn't make it better, so truly this must be a me problem at the end of the day. And it's something that if a convenient little pink and purple graphic on Google Images can tell me how to fix it and that doesn't work, then it must be a really deep set me problem that I need to fix. Truly it couldn't possibly, because the world is awful right now and has been historically for women basically forever. Sadness in general is also a very distinctly gendered phenomenon, and there are a lot of very uniquely female or feminine forms of depression. I keep coming back to it, PMS, or just the entire, you know, how you exist at different stages of your cycle, and this being tied to your reproductive status as well, instead of just the idea of a hormonal cycle. I use the word PMS because it's a lot easier. There is a difference between like the reproductive cycle and how people use this as a form of social control over women, and just hormonal cycles that everyone has and exist also separate from menstrual cycles and hormonal cycles related to reproduction as well. So I'll try to be as clear as I possibly can with those two, but they are technically a different thing. And a lot of people conflate the two of them, both coming back again to that form of social control over women, pretending like only women have hormonal cycles. yeah, it's a really gendered phenomenon. It comes back a lot to how you interact with your own femininity, and how you interact with different parts of yourself that are more feminine coded, quote unquote, and really embedded in your socio-cultural sphere as well, specifically economic side of it. The way I experience my femininity as like a non-binary person living in Ireland who emigrated, lived in the American South, this, that, and the other, is going to be entirely different from how like an upper middle class person in like New York City would experience their femininity, because it is really tied to economic status, to cultural status, and to how you interact with the cultural ideals of family. And a lot of that comes back again to this hegemonic power of diagnosis, this overarching issue, this umbrella that comes over all people in general, all people who deviate from this norm of patriarchy, to be diagnosed with an issue. And the second you're diagnosed, it becomes a problem that you need to fix and you need to focus on for yourself. Again, meaning that the issue is you, and if you can't fix the issue, then you cannot be fixed, and it's something that you need to focus on working on yourself. It's this very like negative view of, or this very negative perception of the self that the like medical industry, specifically the pharmaceutical industry, is trying to place on people. On the topic of anxiety specifically, the age of depression thing is really important. Anxiety is still a huge problem. There are a lot of nervous people in the world, and that is because the world is a really freaky place right now. And this is easy enough to understand if you say like, oh, the goal of medicalization is to control, not necessarily to ease people. Because if we are over-prescribing anti-anxiety medications, surely this would say, like, you know, if we're giving people pills to make them calm down, then maybe the goal is to calm people down instead of to, you know, that's what I'm looking for here, instead of just to control. But ultimately it comes back to the fact that this is a controlling force with how people interact with the world around them instead of just themselves. Paxil was an anti-anxiety medication in the early 2000s, late 2000s, that became one of the most prescribed medications of all time in a very, very short period of time. In less than 5 years, it went from getting approval to being the most prescribed medication of all time. It ended up being taken off the markets because it messed with a lot of young kids, where it was rushed through the approval processes based on lobbying from the pharmaceutical industry in America. That was our bad team. We did that one, and it got sort of approved everywhere way too quickly, and it ended up having some really negative impacts on children's development and on pregnant people. If they took it while they were pregnant, it would have negative effects both on the pregnant person, and there were a not insignificant amount of cases of a child being born severely mentally disabled because of their parent taking Paxil during pregnancy. But all of this, again, comes back to this idea of decreased distress tolerances, and people were so ready, so excited for this pill that would fix their anxiety that the pharmaceutical industry got a huge amount of support, a huge amount of public funding to lobby the government to have it approved much faster than it had to be, or should have been. And more than anything, this idea of marketing medications. You guys don't have ads for medicine here? That's crazy. There are advertisements for medicine on American TV for, like, you know, antidepressants, anti-anxiety pills, for like heart medication. There's ads for Viagra, just like on TV. That's weird. And it always ends with this, ask your doctor if blank medication is right for you. And then like 30 seconds of someone talking so fast, explaining every risk of the medication, which is just silly to listen to. But more importantly, it's this idea of like marketing medications and having the direct pharmaceutical to individual pipeline exist instead of having a doctor as a middleman. No, I did it again. Middleman for doctor. No, middle person. In most countries, having a doctor as a go-between means that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have this direct power over the individual, but with ads for medication, it means that the pharmaceutical industry is able to directly influence the consumer as a consumer instead of just as a person experiencing a symptom. Paxil even had like a quiz you could take on their website where you could fill out, it's like, have you felt nervous? Like, have you felt weird in a way you couldn't identify in the past week? And ultimately, all of it would be like, you should talk to your doctor about Paxil, because Paxil might be right for you. Just no matter how you filled it out, it would tell you that Paxil is right for you, and you might have anxiety. And then all of that, specifically Paxil, switches into this idea of recreational drug use, specifically the Valium epidemic, and this sort of endless benefit of treatment. Anything you do should come back to a treatment, a pill that you can take to make you better. There's specifically this sort of this deified / demonic parallel that's drawn between the two, where your doctor might prescribe you with a pill, and like, you know, there's always going to be a little pill to fix your little problems, but you are also demonized for reaching out for help if you decide that you need help. You may, you know, end up self-medicating. May that be both through overconsumption of alcohol, use of drugs, use of prescription drugs that are against medical advice. And a lot of this comes back down to, despite the fact that we've deified the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the existence of a pill, we haven't actually deified taking that pill. We have made it an entirely negative process, specifically for women, to reach out for help and to both admit that like they need help and that they have failed at what they're supposed to have achieved. It's also this idea of mental illness being a false category, that we've completely made up the idea of mental illness, or the pharmaceutical industry has invented this notion of mental illness as a way to control, instead of mental illness or just deviance within your own brain being like something that happens sometimes, but rather the idea of mental illness is fake, we made it up. And therefore we can invent a new pill for every new problem that we invent. There have been, in the first edition of the DSM-5, there were 65 conditions that a person could have. In the first edition of the DSM, 60-some-odd conditions, and the most recent, there's over 300 that you can have. Over the course of like 50-some-odd years, we have exponentially increased the ways a person can be sick. We have like antisocial personality disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, a bunch of new ways that a person can be like deviating from the norm, and a bunch of new ways that a person can be prescribed with being sick, quote unquote, when in reality it's just inconvenient deviance from a norm. Again, this comes back to self and over-medicating and Valium. I just found out the other day people can still get prescribed with Valium. That's crazy. It's supposed to be a painkiller, but it was super overprescribed in the 60s, and it led to what was known as the Valium epidemic, and actually triggered what later became the war on drugs, and this overarching sort of hatred of anything that was described as a drug. It's, like I said, it's painkiller. It has some mental effects on a person as well, sort of slurred speech, slowed down thinking processes. Betty Ford, President Ford's wife, was actually addicted to Valium the whole time he was in office, and she actually went to rehab for about 5 months while he was in office, and it became this really big thing about reaching out for help and demonstrating that, you know, like this can happen to anyone. And a lot of that was because Betty Ford was the wife of the president, so she had like a lot of power and a lot of resources that didn't exist for most people. But it became this sort of teaching moment. There was an organization that existed that really fueled this sort of Betty Ford as the example of what a woman can be, should be, and how she should interact with this idea of over-medicating. And this same group actually ended up really buddying up to Reagan for the war on drugs, because they very much dug into the socio-cultural sphere of self and over-medicating of drugs. Because surely a rich white woman doing Valium is very, very, very different than a poor black person smoking weed every once in a while if they want to. It's a very different thing. And they use this to fuel this form of mostly racism, but there was a huge element of misogyny that existed in it as well. And it is ultimately why their movement ended up failing, was because they refused to be at all intersectional with it, and why there's still this huge over-medicating of women with painkillers, especially through the 70s. And still now, women are far more likely to be prescribed with these types of drugs for non-pain-related conditions than men are. Oh my god, that's the end. So yeah, in short, that's my rant about why I hate medicine. It's There's around 20 minutes of the class left. Please ask me questions. I have so many thoughts on this. This is like one of the longest papers I've ever wrote. And then I went home after the break and ended up writing more because I was just so mad about all of it. So does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, etc.? Literally anything. Yeah.
The marketing of medication, did that really begin with the Sackler family, or was there somebody who started that before?
In general, marketing of medications really did begin with that, specifically with opiates and stuff. And this trying to go directly to the consumer, that's where it really kicked off exponentially. But there are ads that have been published in magazines all the way back to the 40s and 50s for things like Valium, for diet meth to help housewives in the 50s. There's this really awful ad of this skinny little blonde lady lounging in a chair, smoking a cigarette, and it's life got you down? Be like her. Take meth. It's insane. It doesn't actually say meth. I cannot remember the name brand for what meth was, but it was methamphetamine. So it's been a really existing problem for a really long time, and women were one of the groups that was originally targeted by advertising of medication, and then it moved into just in general targeting impoverished people. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
What do you think of the kind of use of weed and stuff like that as medication nowadays, and kind of how it's becoming legalized in many countries again?
I think it's really good to both decriminalize and, in a lot of instances, legalize literally every single drug. I think drug use is an addiction and can be an addiction in the same way, most or is a sickness in the same way other addictions are. And a person should be able to access treatment for that if they wish to stop or want to do it safely. In the specific case of marijuana, I've not studied medicine is the really important thing. So I actually don't know how effective it is overall. I know it's been demonstrated to be really, really helpful, specifically for people with eating disorders, people with, I can't remember the exact name for it right now, but this gastric disorder that makes you throw up all the time. It's been really helpful with that, and really helpful for anxiety. I think in general, if something helps a person, they should use it, and they should not face any, pushback for wanting to do it. I do think there is a risk of marijuana being prescribed by physicians becoming this sort of new issue and this sort of new age form of Valium or whatever. But I think in general, if something really does help someone, then they should have access to it. If it helps them in a way that matters, not in a way that can be helped by a more structural change. Mm-hmm.
What made you want to research this topic?
Honestly, it was going to the Women's Health Conference and being just so annoyed at this idea of women's health being inherently tied to reproductive health. My whole family is also in the medical industry. Both my brothers are in medical school right now. Both my parents work in hospitals, so I've also been very aware of medicine and the way that it interacts with people for a very long time. I'm also from a region in America called Appalachia, which was ravaged by the opioid epidemic. And so for my entire life, over-medication and treatment, accessing methadone and being able to interact with medicine in a way that isn't inherently harmful to oneself has been really important to me my whole life. So, yeah.
How do you see the topic of neurodivergence kind of with the age of depression and anxiety? Because in the last 5 years we've seen so much more about it, and kind of, again, where it can be really good to have discussions, and there's the overdiagnosis.
God, I have such big thoughts about this. I think TikTok ruined us. And I think Instagram Reels are the final nail in our coffin for our generation, just in general. I think there is something to be said about the fact that a lot of people, specifically really young people, will be sort of on the internet finding themselves, finding out who they are for the first time in their life, and identify with things that are traits of autism, things that are traits of ADHD, or just in general, things that are traits of quote-unquote mental illnesses. And if you really identify with that, then there's no reason you shouldn't be able to access more social, quote-unquote, treatments, like, accessibility things for it. But at the same time, not everyone who gets nervous in crowds is automatically autistic. Not everyone who's, gets really interested in one topic is autistic. Not everyone who gets hyper from sitting still all day has ADHD, that kind of thing. I think, I don't know, because there's also a really close tie between the increase in ADHD diagnoses, specifically amongst young boys, and the push for the advent of Adderall and, what's it called? Ritalin. Vyvanse does not try and advertise. They're just doing their own thing. Ritalin really was for a very long time overprescribed, specifically boys under 10. Mostly because when Ritalin came in, people didn't know that girls could have ADHD yet. So that's all that there was. But in general, young boys for a very long time were overprescribed with these types of medications. In general, I think if it has a really negative impact on a person to be prescribed with something, then we should consider that. But at the same time, if young people are trying to find themselves for the first time and finding community with other neurodiverse people, regardless of if they actually are neurodiverse or not, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you're prescribing them with actual medications because of it, that's where some fault might come in. Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of kind of identifying with your disorder, or I guess using that as a personality, or as kind of, this part of your personality, probably especially with mental disorders, but it kind of opens up this talk and kind of making it less of a taboo, but on the other hand, can it be kind of really dangerous of this, you have this kind of felt pressure to identify yourself with everything there is in the world, and kind of find your niche of almost making it popular to have certain
you can stay, we're talking about DID, it's okay, that's the new thing on TikTok, I think. Yeah, fair. That's the new trend right now, to have dissociative identity disorder. It's the hot new thing. Yeah. Or at least it was a year ago, and it still is in some subcultures. I think that, it's sort of the same answer to the first question. I think if a person genuinely finds comfort and community with a group of people, then especially for really young people, it is not my business to tell a 13-year-old how to live their life. I was atrocious when I was 13. I should have been in federal prison for the way I was behaving. It is none of my business for how another person copes with the emotional load that is being 13 years old. At the same time, I think a conversation about internet safety really needs to be had. because especially people our age and up, we are aware that there are really young people on the internet, and we need to start acting like the person we might be talking to on the other end of the, on their other computer might be a child. So I think that is a really important conversation to have. There's this whole thing of like, you know, as a parent, you shouldn't let your kid have just unmonitored access to the internet, first of all. But on the other side of the spectrum, like, people do need to be more aware of the fact that both on the side of you don't know who you're talking to, it could be like some 40-year-old dude. It could also be like a 9-year-old. That is a completely unexplored thing about how weird the internet is right now, especially considering everything's everything right now. And we have no idea how anything works at the end of the day. It's just sort of people doing their own thing. I think there is a lot to be said about the danger of over-identifying with, or almost like micro-labeling your own identity with illness or mental illness as the cornerstone of that. I do also think that that is just sort of inherently a part of being young, is that you want to micro-label your identity and you want to sort of find this sense of automatic community with people, especially in an age of just existence in general, where there's no third spaces, and in a lot of parts of the world, it's criminalized to be a kid and having friends and hanging out with them. Like, there's like just straight up malls that are banning teenagers from being in there. There's nowhere to hang out and have friends. So if the place where you're hanging out and having friends is self-diagnosing and micro-labeling every part of your identity on the internet, then that is more of a societal issue than the problem of an individual who's like, you know, a child again. Yeah.
So I feel like this might be like a bit of a reach, but don't you feel like this kind of like TikTok and just self-diagnosing is kind of the same, like it's kind of the same role as religion was like maybe a century ago? Like, you're trying to shift responsibility from yourself, and instead of owning up to your actions, you're like, actually that wasn't me, it was because of this or this illness that I have. It's kind of the same as just like going into a confession booth and being like, actually, sorry, I did this.
Sorry, my bad. That was the devil. That was the devil inhabiting my body. That was my bad team. Let me think about that. I'd say there is definitely this sort of overarching problem. It's not even a societal issue. I think it might just be like basic human psychology, where we don't like being the bad guy. It really sucks to realize you're the one who is actually being the bad guy in a situation. You are the one who is being a bit crazy. And so it is really tempting to be like, you can't be mad at me. I'm literally autistic and 12. Like, it's not my fault. But in general, I think, yeah, like having a scapegoat for why you might have been, like, you know, acting in a certain way. I wouldn't say mental illness has outright replaced the use of religion, both in, like, you know, confessions and that kind of stuff. But I would say that the way that the two interact with each other is very similar in the way that people use that force in their life. Because I think the same people who now are self-diagnosing themselves and are existing on the internet, like sort of blaming things on things that are out of their control, wouldn't necessarily turn to religion if they were transported 100 years back in time. I think there are other things that they would have done, but I do think that the way the two are used is very similar. Other questions? I think we have time for one more. Yeah?
Do you have any opinions on brands of medication, that there's some brands for different types of medication?
So, okay, that changes. My overall answer is I think that I think that competition in every industry is really important, and we need to overall change the way that trust laws exist in the world to increase competition, and part of that is meaning that we need to have more brands that make the same thing, essentially. I think it's a really good thing when done correctly, because it decreases prices. If we're just outright, you know, staying in a capitalistic system, I think it's really good that there are a lot of different brands that make basically the exact same medication. If we are switching into a different economic system, then that answer changes entirely. I think it would be really important to find what is the most effective, not even necessarily the cheapest form or way of producing essential medications. For example, like, heart medications. Like, if a person stopped taking, like, their ibuprofen, I don't know, it's something that helps your heart rate, they die. Like, that'd be it for them. Not every medicine and not every form of medication is a form of social control. Some people just dead-ass need to take a pill or their heart will stop working. And, like, that's also a really important thing to consider in that whole debate is, like, how do we interact with medication as a form of social control? And medication also is, like, an actual miracle and, like, a phenomenal feat of human accomplishment. But in general, I think having multiple brands, at least in our current way that we exist in the world, our current socioeconomic thing, having multiple brands is better, both because it drives price down and it can fuel innovation to make new things that are better. Yeah. Beautiful. I think that's all. Thank you guys. This was fun.